to everybody who's out there. This is going to be a great webinar with a great presenter. The topic today, of course, creative and effective use of the Who Am I workbooks in adult treatment. I always was a big fan of that name, Who Am I and Why Am I in Treatment? And remember a conference organizer who was talking about them saying, geez, maybe I should get copies of these workbooks for myself. And so before I turn it over to Steve Sawyer, MSSW and CGP, coming to us from Minneapolis, Minnesota, I want to take a moment and tell you a little bit about NERI Press. NERI's mission is to share the cutting-edge research and best practices that are emerging in our field. For many years, NERI has accomplished that mission only through book sales, but with changes in both publishing and the technology world, we've been exploring what it means to maintain this mission while moving forward towards a more expansive view of our work as a knowledge dissemination organization. And with that goal, over the past 5 or 6 years, NERI Press has offered online courses, free newsletters, face-to-face workshops, and now most recently these webinars by some of our most internationally recognized authors like Steve. When we seek to determine what are the most pressing questions, the most urgent training needs, or the most desired presenters, we can always accomplish our goals better if we have your suggestions and input and feedback. And as one who's reviewed a lot of emails over the years, making suggestions and asking questions of NERI Press, I'm really grateful for all of your thoughts. Whether positive or negative, we always appreciate the engagement. And so, Tim, I think at this point we'll just start with our first poll and ask how many people have participated in a NERI Press webinar before? And Tim, I'm going to take it for granted that you have the poll going because for some reason I can't see it on my screen. I like to say I've never seen the webinar if it didn't have at least a small technical problem. So there you go, thank you. Polling in progress for attendees only. And I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, but if you find these webinars helpful, we hope you'll consider becoming a sponsor of the series. It's a bit like National Public Radio, where it's your donations that make this series happen. We are very excited about the whole new slate of webinars for the 2016 and 2017 season, which are now up at the website at NERI.com. Becoming a sponsor now, and if you become a sponsor now, you guarantee yourself a seat for every webinar in the entire series. And you will not only get yourself registered, but you'll also get a free gift of 2 NERI Press books, Current Perspectives and Current Applications in working with children and adolescents who have been sexually abused. You can also now get free CE credits for attending the live webinar as well. It's truly a win-win for everybody, and it is your support that continues to make these kinds of things possible. So, okay, let me switch gears just a little bit. Here's our learning objectives for today. That first, you'll become more informed about workbooks as a treatment adjunct. Number 2, you'll understand how workbooks and treatment structure can be integrated, something that Steve and I have talked about quite a bit. And you'll appreciate the opportunity for self-study that workbooks can also offer to clients. So when you should also know that the PowerPoints will be posted at the NERI Press website shortly after the webinar is over, and the organizers will be posting a recording of this webinar next week. When the workshop is over, please be sure to answer the short survey at the end. We'd love your feedback. And then after about a week, we'll send you a follow-up email that has a link to the recordings as well as certificates of attendance, which you can download. This year, NERI Press is partnering with the Global Institute for Forensic Research, also known as GIFR, to provide free CE credits for those who attend the live webinars. You should have been given a chance to sign up when you registered, but if for some reason you didn't see that option on the registration form or have since changed your mind, you can email Kristen Lobish, and here's her email address, KLOBISCH. That should look like Klobish at NERI.com. Guyfer will be in touch with you about taking a short quiz to qualify for your CE credits. And also as a part of this, you'll get a discount on the workbooks. This is the code you can see here, a 20% discount on the workbook using this discount code FEBR06, FEBR06. I think that's a pretty clear hint that this offer ends on February 6th of this year. Who am I and why am I in treatment introduces clients to the assessment and treatment of people who've abused. It helps them to understand why they sexually abuse, why they might deny it, and what to expect when you're in treatment. Why did I do it again and how can I stop? Explores cycles of abuse, the sexual abuse cycle, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that make up cycles, values, clarification, relapse prevention, etc., etc. I will let Steve talk about this more. And I should also mention that over the years, it's been abundantly clear to me that this workshop series, workbook series, is Neary Press's most popular. So this is one that's been around a while and it's been revised, and we have the opportunity today to listen to Steve Sawyer describe them. He's worked with them for quite some time. So the first thing, before I forget, I want to make sure that I tell you that Steve has a cold. So he wanted me to mention that, or he's recovering from a cold, so that if you hear a slight scratchy sound in the audio, that unfortunately might not be a technical glitch, but might just be poor Steve. I really want to hand it to Steve for doing this. If you've never come to work sick, I'm sure maybe you don't know how it is. I am fond of saying that if you haven't wept in your supervisor's office or wound up throwing up on the job, honestly, you've never really done this work. And that might be a little bit crass to say, but if you really truly work in the field, you know what I mean. So let me just tell you a bit about Steve. You see a picture of him here. Steve earned his MSSW from the University of Wisconsin in 1980 and is a clinical social worker and certified group psychotherapist. He is founder and president of Sawyer Solutions, LLC, a private clinical and consulting practice. He serves as a consultant to Catholic religious orders on matters of sexual abuse prevention and management. He has published articles and book chapters on a program for men who use prostitutes, group therapy with people who have sexually abused, sexual dysfunction amongst sex offenders, and sex offender treatment program outcome research. And I want to let you know, as somebody who's known Steve for a long time, that this is actually a very brief listing of his accomplishments. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Steve.
My voice. This is the worst cold I've had in my entire adult life, and so I'm struck by how long it's taking to get my voice back. But here we are today, talking about the workbooks, Who Am I series. So I'm going to share with you some information about the workbooks and talk a little bit about my experience with them. And I think at some point we've done, or we're going to do a survey about a little bit about your programs, and we'll do what we can to integrate a little bit with your program structure. It's a tall task, but we're trying to give you a view of these workbooks and some flexible ways to use them. So we saw the learning objectives. I don't think I'll repeat those here. The goal here is just to simply get you to get an appreciation for the variety of ways these workbooks can be used in different programs. So I'm hoping that you get a sense of the structure. I'll spend a couple minutes on that, and then talk about some of the particular workbook assignments and how to connect individual assignments and group process. And that's potentially a long conversation, so we won't delve deeply into it. Each workbook has a different flow. We'll talk about that briefly. And then I'll try to spend a little bit of time talking about individualizing treatment using these workbooks. So the three workbooks, very briefly, Who Am I and Why Am I in Treatment? The second one, why did I do it again and how can I stop? And the third workbook, enhancing empathy. These were originally written by Rob Longo and Hogan Laron Bays in around 2000. They've been reprinted a number of times, and then we updated all three of these workbooks in 2011. They've been widely used all over the country, and I think more widely dispersed than that. So to start with, all three workbooks, the foundation is there's educational material in each chapter. The chapter starts with topics, different topics, and an educational section that can be read privately or read in a group or read by clients on their own time. And then at the end of each chapter, there's questions, assignments, or ways that the clients can apply the educational material in the workbook. So each chapter can be used independently, and each chapter has separate questions, assignments, lists to make, self-examination to do. So each chapter can be worked with individually. However, many of the chapters build on each other, so the content, there's a flow to the content, but it's not necessarily purely linear entirely. So there's a lot of opportunity for individualizing how the workbooks can be used and how different pieces of material can be pulled out of the workbooks. Here comes my voice. One of the things that I'm aware of, and I'm curious if we can get some feedback from the audience, in my program and programs that I've been in, the starting point is some kind of structure, written goals or goals with assignments or some variation of that. I've not known very many programs that were purely process, though there might be some. So the question is, if you have a treatment program and it has goal 1 and goal 2 and a goal about offense dynamics or offense cycles or patterns, maybe a goal about relationships, how do you draw from materials like these workbooks and interconnect them with existing program material? So I'll spend a couple minutes on that. I want to go forward just a little farther first. Are we ready to do this this survey? I don't know if I can get some feedback from the organizers yet. I'm curious because how your program is organized is going to be obviously affect how you can use these workbooks. So if you have it could be either a group-based program, as most programs are, or it could be more individual focused. Some programs have group and individual, and also educational models. And so how to integrate these workbooks, depending on the program format. In my view, they could be used in any format. They could be part of an educational structure in a module. They could be brought into groups where there's existing assignments. So I think there's application regardless of the structure. Group size is a question. I'm asking that question because I'm curious if there's larger groups, more than 12, there's more opportunity for discussion, maybe more opportunity for lecture, maybe presenting assignments, maybe less opportunity for group process than there would be if the groups are closer to 8 or smaller.
Steve, can I jump in for a second?
Please, yes.
So I honestly am a little confused as to whether or not we were going to do this in a polling fashion. What I'd like to do is invite the audience at this point to enter into the questions, any answers that you might have, so that Steve and I have some idea of what kind of structure, existing treatment goals and assignments. And as you type these in, I'll be able to see them. So you can feel free just to enter this information, and I should have made it clear earlier as well that I'll be keeping track of questions as well. So every voice matters, every question's important, but we're really interested in what you have to say. So sorry for the interruption, Steve.
That's fine. I'm going to go ahead. Let's come back to these questions, and I'm hoping maybe there's some audience participant questions about this. My point here is simply, regardless of the structure of your program, I see opportunities to bring in the materials from the workbooks in different ways depending on how they fit into the program flow that you have. So a little bit of more introduction. Who am I and why am I in treatment? Some of the contents, the chapter headings, what is treatment? It's a great introduction to literally, for a newer client, what is treatment? What can they expect from it? How do I work on my problems is another chapter. And again, clients come to treatment. I've had 3 new intakes this week, and one of their questions is, what do I do? What is treatment? So it's, I think, something that every program deals with in the beginning of a relationship with a client as they come into treatment. So there's 2 examples of this early material that a newer client in treatment could benefit from. My abuse cycle, that comes up in both workbooks in different ways. In this case, in this workbook, it introduces the idea of a cycle. For most people, that's a foreign concept. And so an introduction to the idea of repeating thoughts and behaviors and emotions and how those connect, that's a great introduction. And then another example of a chapter in this workbook, preventing relapse. We know that our goal is to prevent abuse. That's one of the most important things ATSA members do. And preventing relapse, introducing that to clients early, I mean, that's the goal of treatment, is to have them not do it again. So this, excuse me, this is a chapter that steps into that content. In the second workbook, Why Did I Do It Again and How Can I Stop? It really functions as 2 workbooks. There's part 1 and part 2. And part 1 is really about cycles, an exhaustive examination of cycles and different models of thinking about cycles and what repeats over time. So some of the contents in this workbook, once you understand your cycle, then there's a question of learning new responses, which makes sense, right? We want clients to understand the pattern and then behave and think and act differently. In the second half of this book, positive self-talk. So many of our clients have a very, very negative self-view, and in fact, their own detrimental thinking is part of their cycle, part of what keeps that pattern going. So learning to do affirmations is an example. Rehearsing, behavioral rehearsal, and behavioral contracts are more behavior-oriented chapters later on in this workbook. Third workbook, excuse me, enhancing empathy. I want to start with, there's a flow of conversation around ATSA and the listserv that comes up about the question of, well, if empathy is not statistically related to reoffense, then should we be engaging in empathy-related treatment work? And I was thinking about this earlier and chatting with David a little bit. If you step back for a minute, almost every program has material about relationships. We know that relationship issues are dynamic risk factors. Communication skills are often a deficit. Concern for others is a dynamic risk factor. Empathy is embedded in all of those human relationships, deeply embedded. So if we take it away from focusing on empathy for those who were harmed, and we think more generically about empathy in our day-to-day lives, this workbook is very, very relevant to many, if not all, but many aspects of most programs. I have a client who, I have a structured program where there's goals and then assignments for each goal. And I have a goal about understanding the impact of behavior. It's not quite the same as empathy. It's close. I have a client who struggles deeply. He's very self-centered. And I gave him one of the chapters out of this, the one about how does my behavior affect others, just to help sensitize him to looking at those around him rather than being so self-centered. He found it very useful. So there's different, again, chapters in this book. One, very beginning, what is empathy? Some clients don't know what that means. How does their behavior affect others? How to build empathy is another chapter. Compassionate action is another chapter. So there's, again, a variety of approaches to the idea of empathy, the concept of empathy, and skills, ways of thinking, exercises that sensitize clients to their effect on others, helping clients look outside themselves. I find it to be a very useful workbook. So a couple ideas about different ways to use the workbooks. And I'm going to refer literally to a couple of chapters here. And again, there's chapters, and then there's particular assignments. So, for example, in the Who Am I workbook, chapter 4 is what is treatment, and it talks about, it uses a football metaphor. It talks about change process, and it talks about defense mechanisms. I've not met a client who couldn't identify numerous defense mechanisms that they use in life, totally separate from their offense. So that in this chapter it introduces the idea of defense mechanisms, and denial maybe being the most obvious, but minimizing, rationalizing, justifying. So it's a good generic introduction. It could be given to any new client in a program, and he could read it's a short chapter, Introduction to Cycles, and then there's 3 exercises. Look at the list of defenses, look at the list of problems, which problems would you like to work on, and a list of behaviors that you've done repeatedly. So it's very generic and very pragmatic. In this same workbook, another chapter, Abuse Cycle, chapter 7, and it's a bit of an introduction. What is your cycle? Feelings, thoughts, behaviors, what was your offense, and then an exercise at the end about understanding thought defects. So really straightforward. The chapter, the reading is maybe 4 pages. It's very accessible level of reading material. In the Enhancing Empathy workbook, chapter 2. I think I found that one particularly helpful. How does my sexual behavior affect others? It is an introduction to some of the research about the impact of sexual abuse on those who are abused. It introduces some research. It introduces some personal experiences, and their stories, personal stories. Another chapter, so again in the larger workbook, why did I do it again? I find this really interesting. Chapter 5 is a chapter about values clarification. I don't know about you, but I've had many clients who come to treatment. They're devastated by the offense, by being arrested, all of the consequences that they've already experienced. And they sit in the office and they become lost, and they're saying, well, I don't even know who I am anymore. I thought what I knew was important, but what I did was not who I am. And so this chapter 5 about values clarification is, I think, an interesting exercise. And very simply, who am I? And what happened to my values? What happened to who I thought I was? And how did I get so distorted and twisted in my thinking that I could do the offense that I did? So there's assignments at the end, and it uses the idea of negative values and positive values. Again, introducing the idea of distorted thinking, which we distort into thinking, well, I value sexuality, but in fact, a person's valuing very, very harmful sexual behavior. And it helps them sort out good values, bad values, positive, negative, and some of the consequences of values that were not positive. It could be a standalone exercise. It could be part of a larger exercise about impact. It could be a different exercise about understanding oneself. So some other examples then, that I think could be very good standalone in the Enhancing Empathy book, Chapter 1, What is Empathy? It's amazing how many clients that I've met, they might have the right words, they might sound like they understand it, but they don't appreciate the depth and complexity of what empathy can be. So there's an idea about why bother with empathy, feeling for yourself, and being able to understand self as part of understanding others, understanding the emotional aspects of empathy, appreciating that pity is not empathy, for example. And then there's exercises at the end, definition. Here's an interesting one. What is it like to grow old? Well, for my 20-something clients, they have no idea what it's like to be 30 years old, much less older. I won't say how much older. Another exercise, putting yourself in your parents' shoes. Fascinating idea. What is it like to be your parent? What was it like to be your dad when you were 14 years old or 22 years old? So there's, again, assignments for each of these chapters that I think are very accessible for a wide range of reading levels, and yet complex enough for clients who are more sophisticated in their understanding. Another chapter out of this same book, Chapter 2, I mentioned that a few minutes ago. How does my behavior affect others? And that, again, has 9 different questions at the end of the chapter about for example, when a woman goes to court after being assaulted, she often feels like she is being put on trial. She's verbally challenged and made to feel guilty by the opposing counsel. What would you feel if you were a victim of assault and treated like this? How many of our clients can put themselves in the position of being questioned about their actions when they were assaulted? Our clients don't go there very easily. Another, finally, and then I think we might have some questions, I'm hoping, but another example, the whole section 2 now in this book, why did I do it again, how can I stop? It's a 2-part workbook. The first part is understanding cycles, very in-depth examination of repeating patterns of behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that would to me, be a good adjunct for practically any approach to dissecting an offense and offense patterns. And then the second part of the book is change. It's all about change. So Chapter 1 is Foundations for Change, and for example, Chapter 2 is Stopping Abusive Thoughts and examples of that. Later on, there's strategies for escaping risk situations and positive self-talk. There's a nod to what we think of as mindfulness. There's a nod about relaxation, Chapter 8. So there's various chapters that can flow together, but again, in my view, can easily be used as adjunct to an existing treatment structure. I'm going to pause there and give my voice a rest for a second. I'm wondering if we have questions yet from the audience.
All right. Yeah, Steve, thank you so much for that. That is a great start to all of this. Definitely looking forward to addressing some of the questions that I've seen. First, let me just summarize what I saw. Some of the pieces flew by rather quickly. I'll also turn on my camera so that you can see me. But what I saw in the who are we and what are we doing when we're in treatment, I saw that a lot of the folks that are attending today are doing the real front lines kind of work. I didn't see anybody who had group sizes less than 8. One person talked about 8 to 12 range. Somebody else said routinely over 8. In terms of how long groups last, I was seeing anything from an hour to 90 minutes. We did have one person who does individual therapy only. I hope that this is useful. I've really enjoyed one particular comment, which was, "I am a person-centered psychotherapist." So thank you for that. Also nice, by the way, to see some very familiar names, people who've clearly been on NERI webinars and the ATSA listserv for that matter as well. And so, Steve, I guess what I want to say is we've got the real front lines, hardcore, grizzled, been there, done that kind of clinicians. In terms of questions that we got, the first one that I saw was, when you use the terms sort of like self-centered, or are we talking narcissistic? The question was, do you recognize, or excuse me, recommend any kind of assessments? I think what I was reading behind the lines was sometimes our clients have spent a lot of time thinking primarily of themselves. I try not to say this in a pejorative way. I could think of a million reasons why that might be, but do you have any sort of ways that you go about assessing the narcissism and the role of narcissism in people's lives? I realize that's a great big question, but I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, and I don't use a particular assessment when I see more what I think of as narcissistic. What I do more often is ask clients their view of themselves, their view of other people, and do kind of an in vivo assessment and a kind of a process assessment as they tell stories. Are they telling stories about from their view out to other people, or are they telling stories that are inclusive of themselves and their relationships? So they tell stories in terms of a relationship they have with someone, and they use that then as a reflection back when they tell a story about something that happened with someone. Then sometimes the question is, well, tell me about your friend in this narrative, and they say, well, I don't know, I didn't even think about what they were thinking and feeling. I was so focused on myself. So I do it more that way than using any kind of formal assessment.
And important to notice that it might be obvious, but I'll say it anyway, that treatment does involve an ongoing assessment process. Very often we tend to think about the assessment comes first, then you do the treatment, and it might be like that in some places. We're starting to get quite a few questions. Here's a really good one I wouldn't have thought of. Thank you, Stephen, which is what reading level is required for the client to use the workbooks at home?
Reading level, I can't tell you a formal reading level, but I would say 8th grade pretty easily. There might be some words that might be a little beyond 8th grade, but it's very readable. It's very readable, yeah.
Sure, yeah. And I will say, as somebody who's also published a bit, that this is what editors are really, really good for. Every editor I've ever worked with was brilliant at saying, I just don't understand this. So that's one nice thing about buying workbooks and taking them home. Here's another one, another interesting question, which is, to what extent are the concepts of the Good Lives model incorporated into the workbooks? Here's something we could talk about a long time.
Yeah, we could, and formally, I will say the Good Lives model is not formally integrated into the workbooks at this point. There's some concepts that nod toward it. There's a couple of exercises, but it's not formally fully integrated. No, it's not.
Okay, yeah.
It doesn't contradict it. Go ahead.
Yeah. There's a real question of how integrated is integrated as well, which is, of course, a bigger issue. By the way, just a couple of small points. One person, Patricia, adds that her groups are 2 hours long and does group weekly and also individual therapy twice a month. Corey asks, are we able to receive the slides from this training? And the answer is yes. I will make it a point to speak more about that afterwards. Steve, I hope I'm not setting you up too much, but my guess is that if people did a Google search on your name, Stephen Sawyer, and perhaps adding Minnesota or the names of the workbooks, they could probably find you directly as well. You have a website.
Yes.
etc. I'm
My,
real. If you see me trying hard not to make a joke, it's your standard joke is that if you type into a Google search either of our names and then add on the term sex offender, you'll probably find us fairly quickly. It's an unfortunate occupational hazard of this. Are the assessments all written, or excuse me, are the assignments all written, or are they experiential in nature? Boy, there's another big. That's a bigger question than it sounds, Steve. Any thoughts?
yeah, they're uh, pretty much written. Uh, I would say some of the exercises invoke putting oneself in someone else's shoes, for example, in the empathy book. So I guess there's an experiential dimension, asking the reader and whoever's writing, the client, to examine something outside themselves. But they're not experiential in the true word of experiential. But they're not just intellectual either. There's emotional assignments about emotion. There's assignments about relationships. Assignments about how would this person feel. So I very much the assignments are draw clients outside themselves into relationships or people around them. Not just a cognitive exercise.
Yeah. Excellent. I think that the term experiential can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. My first entree into it was to think in terms of kids doing ropes courses and things of that nature. What I hear you saying, there's a clinician's cliche. If I'm hearing you correctly, what I hear you saying is also there's the written exercise and then there's the experience of doing it, and that there is a great deal of effective treatment that is simply about the experience itself and an experience within a therapeutic alliance. Is that how you would say it, or?
Yeah, here's an example. Write about one person you see who is having a hard time. And you can't write that from an intellectual perspective. You have to put yourself in the experience of a person who's having a hard time. So that's an exercise in Chapter 4 in the Enhancing Empathy workbook. So I think these do a really good job of invoking the experience of others, and to me that's a dimension of experiential. Yeah.
Sure. Awesome, Steve. A very important question, and one that we haven't really addressed. Well, to read it directly from the box, pediatric clients, I've had several referrals of children under 10 from adults concerned about their behavior. I realize adult versus juvenile treatment is part of the history of our field. Do you have thoughts on what parts of the workbooks can be applied with children that young?
I don't. I would say none. These are not in any way, shape, or form written for children.
Okay, thank you.
And that's not my expertise either, but I would say no, there's other ways to work with children that are much more effective. These are too analytical and too cognitive for children that age. That'd be my response.
Okay.
David, you've got more experience with juveniles.
Sure. It's a very direct answer, and I very much appreciate your candor. I happen to agree. This is something that within the NERI Press community we've talked about, I think, since as long as there's been a NERI Press. The workbooks were originally designed for working with adults. There are very real questions about how much we can extend adult treatment concepts downward into the juvenile world. Going back to the Good Lives model question, the same thing goes there. Here's a model that was developed for the adult world. Does it make sense to extend it downward to juveniles, or should we not have just gone and developed something separately for them? If you don't, it's your webinar, Stephen, not mine, but I might mention that the ATSA task force on children with sexual behavior problems wrote something that's freely available online. I think that Joan Tabachnik and our late dear friend Steve Benjis and I might have reviewed this for the NERI Press newsletter at some time way back in prehistory. But that's a place that I might go. ATSA, Task Force Report on Children with Sexual Behavior Problems.
Right.
So I just wanted to mention that.
Right.
Here's a good question, and possibly loaded one. Are the assignments in these books considered best practice in sex offender treatment? I have thoughts. Steve, what are yours?
Broadly, I would say yes. Um, Aside from the argument about empathy, which I think is worth some more discussion, um, understanding patterns, understanding thought distortions, understanding the role of emotion in offenses, um, relapse prevention is layered into this in several different ways. So yeah, in that sense, absolutely. Um, and you can pick, the nice thing about this, you can pick and choose sections or even assignments out of chapters to roll together with whatever approach you're using. On the whole, these are not, I guess to back up a second, these are not designed to be comprehensive treatment in and of themselves. So to be very careful about saying, you can't buy these workbooks and run clients through the workbooks and say that by itself is all you need to do. They were never thought of that way, as far as I understand. So, but as an adjunct to a currently designed program, I think they're a very good fit.
Yes, I have to. I am not impartial in this area. I have to agree. And if you don't mind my adding to this, I think it's also important to, when we think about best practices, to be careful how we define that term in our field. Steve, from my perspective, it's very easy to imagine these workbooks being used in adherence with the risk, need, and responsivity principles. Everything that you've been talking about up to this point, to me, seems to be focused in the direction of how do we really get this person to respond to the broader treatment package that they're being provided. And the exercises that you've mentioned, I think, on their own, nobody would say, no, you must ask the question this way. But that when in the hands of an experienced clinician, then indeed these workbooks really are best practice, which is why I really appreciated that you revised them back. I can't believe it was in 2011 we were talking
Right.
about this
Right.
beforehand. If I could jump off of that, hold on, one more question. Can the workbooks be utilized as an additional curriculum to address protective factors? That's an excellent question. Thank you, Tracy.
That's a very good question. No, I don't think it's not written. None of them are written in the language of protective factors. There's probably some exercises, and this minute I can't even point to one for you, but I think there's some exercises that can be connected to the idea of protective factors. But the roots of these were back in the 90s, and we were much more pathology focused. That these aren't written from the language of deviance necessarily, but it was focused on what's wrong much more than what's right. And so to me, it doesn't lean heavily toward protective factors. I don't think it contradicts the idea, but doesn't draw from that to start with.
No, see, as you were talking, I was thinking the exercise about what's it like to look at me through the eyes of my parents. Although that is a very sort of direct question that speaks to empathy, it does seem to me that if improving somebody's interpersonal competence is a protective factor, that's a good step on the road to that.
Right. Good point. Good point.
Yeah. So these questions we're getting are actually better than anything I would ask. Austin asks, do you have any data on the outcome of your clients? I know it's really hard to track what happens to clients. Isn't that the truth? And members once they complete a treatment program. So is this something you've been able to do to track outcomes, Steve?
Well, to go back many years, a program I was part of and did supervise for a long time had these workbooks as part of the treatment process. This was in the late 90s. And we did a 5-year study we followed 150 men for 5 years post-treatment, and did recidivism study checks and did interviews with them for 5 years. That was not, just to be clear, the workbooks we weren't testing the results of the workbooks in particular. And I don't know of a program that's actually done that. If there is, I haven't heard of it. But in that case, it was a very comprehensive program, long-term, and the last time we looked at the data, the recidivism rate was well under 10%. But it was a community-based outpatient program, low risk, generally low-risk offenders, so you'd expect that number. But at that point, these workbooks were used a lot in that program. So, but it doesn't point specifically to the results of using these workbooks. These workbooks aren't designed to be a program in and of themselves, so I think it'd be very hard to truly study the effect of the workbooks themselves.
Yeah, sounds good. And did you publish these results, Steve?
That study was published in the International Journal in about 2005.
Oh, nice. All right. Excellent. I'm so glad to hear it. There's just not enough. Paul has an observation that kind of circles back around to what I've been thinking. Best practices seem to emanate from the hands of experienced clinicians who know the work, but most of all know how to deliver it prescriptively and with the wisdom of experience. Steve, you and I were talking about this before. I wonder, how can you use the workbooks as a tool for dedicated personal development? What can clinicians do to be better tomorrow than they are today, and how can these workbooks help?
That's a great question. I think a couple of things, and this takes us on to the second hour. So after 33 years of doing this work, I'm still not fully familiar with everything in the field, much as I've tried to keep up to date with the literature. So that's one is staying open to what's in the literature. What I find interesting about these workbooks is I've gone back and looked at them again for this webinar and read some of the exercises. So I'm circling back to some ideas that were really, really popular 15 and 20 years ago. And there's still elements of them that are relevant today. I did some work with a program who is using the Johari Window. If you remember what that was, that old psychology idea. Sidney Girard, I think, was the author. But transparency, self-transparency. What a simple concept. But how does that fit with our clients who aren't often transparent? So to me, circling back to some basic, tried and true ideas in therapy and psychology is one way. Because even though our field is doing a great job of coming up with new ideas, in my view, this is my personal view, I'm doing therapy. Therapy is not do this exercise and grade you on a scale of 1 to 5 as to whether you finished it or not. That's not therapy. So the subtleties, the relationship, the possibilities of looking much more intrapsychically, or God forbid I'm going to say psychodynamically, in therapy, I think enriches the formality of treating somebody with a sex crime. So I think the richness, if I can get to your point, remembering that we live and work in a world of clinical services and in therapeutic environments and therapeutic relationships is one part. Being creative and drawing in what works. I want to make one pitch. What a great book. It's a few years old now, but the title of the book is Psychotherapy Relationships That Work. Great book about psychotherapy in general and what the research has found that works. So staying open to what the general field of therapy has taught us is another, I think, a really important one.
Excellent. By the way, the author on Psychotherapy Relationships at Work is John Norcross,
Thank you.
Norcross, 2011, I think. I was just looking at it the other day.
Yep.
Couldn't agree more. So a big piece of what you're talking about is, you go to the ATSA listserv, you go to the Neary Press website, you go looking for every resource that you possibly can, and that at the end of the day, very often, it's some of the most basic things that we do in treatment that make the biggest difference. The Therapeutic Alliance, building agreement on goals and tasks, being the person that your clients need you to be in that moment, not necessarily who they want you to be, because then we'd all be in trouble, but all of that sort of thing. And that to some degree there may be more difference between the individual therapists who are using the workbooks than there are between the various workbooks that are available.
Yeah.
So,
I want to take a little detour for a minute back to
nice.
something I don't think I touched on very much, if I can. I'm imagining those of you that are listening have different approaches to your groups. And I made a comment early on about one of the goals is how to intersect assignments like this with a group structure, and how to move that structured assignment mechanistic kind of way to do treatment to an idea of process. And I'll just make share one thought. There's rarely an issue, a problem, a challenge that one client in the group has that the rest of the group has not experienced or won't experience. That's the therapeutic factor of universality. And in that respect, any client, you could have any client do any assignment in these workbooks, have them work it through, prepare their answers, and have them present it to the group as an assignment they're working on, and then have the group give them feedback, and then open it to, well, have the rest of the group reflect on that. How does what Joe is saying about his experience with this exercise, how does the rest of you relate to that? And open it up to the rest of the group and their experience, or what they were thinking or feeling as Joe was going through this assignment. So it's a couple sentences of transition to group engagement, which is a dimension of cohesion, experience of universality, which is a therapeutic factor. Just a couple steps to engaging the whole group around any one of these assignments. That could be done every single time an assignment is done. And that, to me, those are opportunities to engage the whole group around any particular topic. So.
Wow. Okay. So who could have imagined that so much therapeutic process could be found inside a workbook written at an 8th grade level? So Ida did have one question. I think I know the answer, which is, are you aware of any research or any practical use of these workbooks with women?
Oh, I do not know. I don't know of any research at all. I don't see why they couldn't be used. They're not. I don't think they're gender biased, at least not deeply. It doesn't say workbooks for men. The concepts could apply of cycles, emotion, defenses, relationships, empathy. The concepts to me would be applicable. I had not seen them specifically applied in a women's treatment group, for example.
Sure.
So.
Sure. So I know for Ida, who asked, Neary Press published some pretty good material by Susan Robinson on working with adolescent females that might also be useful. Thinking back on your last answer, Steve, I keep coming back to, today the most evidence-based or most practical clinician wants to have a bookshelf with a lot of different options. And even though we need to be clear, men are not the same thing as women, and women don't equal men, and there's going to be different issues, and so on. There's no way that I wouldn't also, from time to time, be picking up these workbooks or other workbooks to say, I need a really good idea for an exercise to do with this woman. So as much as I've tried to be the president of the club of adults are not juveniles and vice versa, it's still the case, excuse me, that we can learn from what's happening in one field or another. So that would be sort of my thought. So I'm going to see what other questions might be out there. We've got a couple more minutes for questions, so if you have a last one, please feel free. Steve, if I could, one that I sort of told you might be coming. When I was at the IATSO conference in Berlin in 2012, a guy opened up a workshop, and he said, these days I have to ask myself, are we personalizing our manuals or are we manualizing our persons? And I thought, that's a really good question. This can be a real debate about manual versus individual therapy. You may have spoken to this some more before, but do you have any thoughts about how to situate these workbooks in treatment? Any further thoughts?
Sure. Several. I've witnessed programs where the program consisted of, you need to do this assignment, and that was what the client was supposed to do, is do the assignment. And that to me is a manual, or example of a manual. And that to me is not personalizing the content of the assignment. And so to me, the assignment is a tool to apply an idea or unravel a thought distortion or whatever the assignment's about. It's an exercise in personalizing that concept to the client, understanding how that tells us what that client needs to work on, and then the treatment is, what does the client change as a result of that exercise or that assignment? And the change is what treatment is about, not the assignment. And that's not a linear process. That's a very individualized path, and it's layered with resistance or insights or new experiences or pain or shame. And so the end of the story is, what does the client get from the assignment? What are they learning and what are they changing? And that's the application of the manual or the assignment or the workbook. These assignments are the step toward what does the client learn and change. And that's the end of the story. The workbook and the assignments are the starting point.
Excellent. That was an awesome answer, especially given the time that we had for it. So I am going to move on. Tim, I think you might want to send me one of those time to share my screen things, but that was the Q&A section. As I wait to get the little prompt, I'm just going to say that, there we go. Hold on one second. Because this I do believe is going to be important. And mention that for some time, NERI Press is offering free CE credits for live webinars. Really encourage you to get involved in that. You're going to get an email sometime within the next 24 hours. If you don't get it from NERI, please check your spam filter like I have to every now and then, or email Kristen Lobish at NERI. Her email again is KLOBISCH@NERI.com. I should also mention that by attending, you're also going to get the NERI Press free electronic newsletter on research to practice. This is something that I think is going on like 9 years, incredibly. Started originally, it was a brainchild of Steve Benjis, who, as many of you know, very sadly, tragically passed away last year. Has been continued by Joan Tabachnik and myself, and we're proud to say that it goes out to a lot of different people. I'll cut to the chase and say that our original mission with this was that we would review one piece of research or important information a month, and that in the time it takes to have a cup of coffee, you can read about some cutting-edge research. So I'm going to put that out there, and also mention that you should really consider becoming a sponsor for the Neary Press webinars. $98 for individuals, $250 for organizations, guaranteed seat at every webinar, access to CE credits, and a couple of awesome Neary Press books. But of course, I'm biased. You can visit the website at nearypress.org to sign up or contact Kristen, whose email you already have. These are some of the folks that are already supporting Neary Press webinars. I really would encourage you to take a look at some of these folks. For many of you, this might be people that you know, folks like Jim Reynolds, who's just an awesome guy out of New Jersey who really believes in this and has been sponsoring it. Indiana's Organization for Adolescents, et cetera, Juliana Jurina, and others. So really want to thank them, as well as Steve. Thank you for this awesome webinar. It's been a long time since I've gotten to hear you speak. For those of you that have been watching, if you haven't gotten that Steve is an incredibly thoughtful practitioner, then I encourage you to go out and see him live sometime. So with that, I think we are at the end of our time. Again, thanks to everybody, and I believe that's a wrap. Thanks again, Steve. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
All right. Yep. Bye-bye.